They will regulate a militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. As promised, we're going to get to our conversation with Jane Coaston from Vox, talking about the trouble on the left when it comes to support for old school gun control laws at a time in which many on the left are calling to abolish the police. Yeah, get rid of prisons. We need real criminal justice reform. How does that play with we need common sense gun safety restrictions like criminalizing the possession of a 15-round magazine, or making it illegal to continue to possess your AR-15, or imposing all kinds of gun licensing laws that make it difficult, if not impossible, for lower-income Americans, many minorities, to legally acquire a firearm. I think it's a problem. You'll hear what Jane Coaston from Vox has to say here in a minute or two as well. But before we get to that, of course, the big news, President Donald Trump, First Lady Melania Trump, testing positive for COVID-19. The news coming in the early morning hours. I've already had a number of folks emailing me asking, all right, so how's this going to impact the election? If I knew, I'd probably be placing some bets on the political betting sites. Obviously, look, this is going to pull President Trump off the campaign trail for, at least a week, if not 2 weeks. We'll see what this means for the Biden campaign. I suspect that you're going to continue to see a lot of events with the circles on the ground and, 5 people sitting there watching Joe Biden talking. Honestly, I don't know what kind of impact this is going to have on the election. You look at other world leaders that have tested positive for COVID-19, Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, Bolsonaro in Brazil. And you look at the polling, actually, for those two individuals that occurred after the COVID-19 positive test came back, and they actually got a bump in polls. So, looking at this purely from a political standpoint, will there be some sympathy votes for Donald Trump having come down with COVID? Possibly. The left obviously going to spin this as it's all Donald Trump's fault, and it's because he wasn't wearing a mask. I got to tell you, if you watch this program on a regular basis, you follow me on Twitter at Cam Edwards, you know that I wear a mask whenever I'm out shopping, whenever I'm out in public. My wife, Miss E, has lung cancer, has had it for 4 years. She's doing pretty good, all things considered. We want to keep it that way. So, I wear a mask out of an abundance of caution. But I don't think that that's 100% protection against catching the coronavirus. As a matter of fact, Governor Ralph Northam and his wife recently tested positive for COVID-19. And I don't recall the media trying to turn that into a political issue for some reason. Yeah, not even in the state of Virginia did that become a political issue. This is going to be quite different. And so I think not only when you're trying to weigh the impacts that the President Trump's positive coronavirus test might have on the election, you also have to weigh in not just the fact that the president himself has been, diagnosed with COVID-19. The odds are extraordinarily good that he'll recover completely from this. But I think you also have to kind of factor in, all right, well, what is the reaction from the average voter going to be to the media overreaction and some of the craziness that we're seeing from opponents of Donald Trump, who within minutes of the president's diagnosis, we're already out there saying things like, well, it's time to invoke the 25th Amendment. The president is incapacitated. No, he's not. No, he's not. That's ridiculous. Again, going back to what happened in the state of Virginia a couple of weeks ago with Ralph Northam and his wife tested positive. It's not like Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax all of a sudden assumed the responsibilities of office simply because Governor Northam had tested positive. Again, the vast majority of people who are diagnosed with COVID-19 aren't going to show any symptoms. The rest are going to have mild symptoms. It's not like a positive test result automatically means you end up in the ICU. So we are seeing that overreaction, and I think that has to be factored in as well. Now, I would also say that this might have an impact on gun and ammo sales. At least I would ordinarily say that, but I'm not sure, honestly, that anything can have more of an impact right now on gun and ammo sales. I think we might have reached it seems like we've reached peak supply. I don't know that we've reached peak demand yet. But, generally speaking, why we've seen this increase in gun sales going back to March of this year is concern among Americans about unrest. And so I think it's entirely possible that the news about President Trump and the media freakout that has ensued is going to make some Americans feel less safe, less secure. They're going to wonder, okay, what's this mean now? Is this, the latest chaos in 2020? And I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if this leads to some more Americans deciding, all right, you know what, this year is just absolutely banana crazy. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to pick up a gun. I'm going to have it just in case I need it to protect myself and my family. Again, the trouble is for those folks that the supply has been pretty picked clean. I mean, you've got gun manufacturers that are operating at full capacity, ammunition manufacturers going 24/7, but already they're unable to keep up with the demand. So those folks who might be prompted to buy a firearm because they're just, now like, well, I don't know what's going to happen with the election or the aftermath. I want to be prepared. I think that's, let's put it this way. I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to believe in 2020. I really don't. We don't know what's going to happen here. But I do know that those folks are liable to run into some difficulties in terms of accessing a firearm and ammunition at the moment. All right. So having said that, let's turn our attention now to our interview with Jane Coaston from Vox. Again, I wanted to have Jane on the program because I wanted to have somebody with a different perspective. And so, listen, this is not a debate. Every time I said something that Jane may have disagreed with, or Jane said something that I may have disagreed with, we didn't stop each other and talk over each other, start yelling at each other. It's a conversation. And so this is a little bit different, honestly, than what you'll see on, a cable news network or something like that. But genuinely, I wanted to get the perspective of somebody who does not agree with me 100%, somebody who covers the issues of gun control, police reform, and somebody who I think can better get in the head, anyway, of those groups on the left that are in conflict with one another, and maybe even those individuals on the left that are in conflict with themselves. The reason why I reached out to Jane specifically, like what prompted this was a tweet from Ayanna Pressley. Actually, it wasn't a tweet. It was a live stream with Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman from Massachusetts, in which she had talked about the racist roots of policing going back to the slave patrols in the pre-Civil War South, and how those racist roots of policing continue today and basically are systemic and endemic throughout law enforcement. Now, whether or not you believe that law enforcement is systemically racist or not, that's not the actual issue. What I found fascinating is that while Ayanna Pressley is in there saying, listen, the police are racist, you just can't trust the police, we got to completely overhaul the criminal justice system, we got to completely rethink policing. Just last year, Ayanna Pressley sponsored a bill in Massachusetts, in the U.S. House, that would have given federal Department of Justice grants to states that implemented Massachusetts-style gun licensing laws. And it was called the MASS Act, Make America Safe and Secure Act. And it was specifically like, hey, let's put Massachusetts-style gun licensing laws on the books in these other states, including the idea that the local police chief, wherever you live, would ultimately be the deciding authority in terms of you getting to exercise your right to keep and bear arms or not. And you could pass a background check. You could be, free of felonies, free of domestic violence misdemeanors. You could never have been adjudicated mentally defective. You could be legally eligible to own a firearm. But under Ayanna Pressley's bill, police would have the power to say, I don't think you're suitable. I know you check all the boxes. I know you pass the background check. I know, you've got your character references. Yeah, because you'd have to supply character references to own a gun too. But even despite all that and all this paperwork I'm looking at, I just don't think you are suitable to own a handgun. And then you would not be legally allowed to do so. So if you really believe that systemic racism is a problem within law enforcement, then why do you want to let law enforcement be the one to determine on a very subjective basis why and how somebody can exercise their Second Amendment rights. That's the conundrum that I had. And that's why I reached out to Jane Coaston of Vox to see if she could help me understand the mindset of Ayanna Pressley and others when it comes to these issues. Take a look and a listen. Jane, thanks so much for coming to the show today. It's good talking with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So first question, just real simple. Am I crazy in thinking that there is a contradiction here in the idea of policing being inherently racist, and yet we need to add more gun laws to the existing system that we have in place?
I think that it's inherently problematic, and that is a real divide here. But I think that it's important to get at there are differing perspectives on this matter. And so I think that I'm going to try and lay this out in as contextual a manner so that it makes sense. So I think that there are the people who are like, policing is inherently violent and racist, thus we must abolish police. Then there are the people who think that what we need are gun reform laws and an increase in gun control laws. And in general, in my understanding, many of those people are not necessarily the same people. The people who are advocating for an increase in red flag laws are not generally the same people who are like, F the police. Those are generally not the same people. And it's interesting because if you go back, I wrote about this for MTV back in the day when I was there, but in the kind of the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2014, 2015, there was no gun control part of their messaging. At no point was that a part of their brand or a part of the specific group, not the kind of overall understanding of the term, but the specific group. There was no gun control portion of that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that they recognized, and you see the increase in the number of Black gun organizations, gun groups that have affiliated themselves or kind of think of themselves under the banner of African American heroes who were strong adherents to gun rights. And you see that the understanding is that without police, there would be an understandable required need to own guns and to self-defense. I think that the challenge here is that those two entities are kind of weaving amongst one another. And so I do think that it seems, if you are asking for an increase in gun laws, and then the people who are going to be enforcing those laws are the same people who are responsible for the death of Philando Castile or John Crawford, for example, I think that doesn't make any goddamn sense to me. Apologies for my language, but that just, you're asking them it's kind of like, are we going to get a different form of law enforcement to enforce those specific laws? But I think that the people who are making the specific abolish the police, yes, we mean abolish the police, they in general are not the same people who are calling for additional gun control legislation. In general, those are two, we're talking about a number of separate constituencies that occasionally sound the same, but just from my view, these are separate entities.
I would agree with that. I think they're still part of the broader coalition on the left, and a broader coalition within the Democratic Party. And there are those. So we'll get to that, but there are also those individuals. Like, one of the reasons why I reached out to you to talk about this, I've been writing about this for a little bit, but Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman from Massachusetts,
right,
said earlier this week, she was doing a live stream, and she talked about how the racist roots of policing date back to the slave patrols in the antebellum South, and how those racist roots of policing have continued on to today. But last year, Congresswoman Pressley introduced federal legislation that would have empowered states to implement Massachusetts-style gun licensing laws, including specifically the idea that the local police chief would determine the suitability of applicants to own a firearm. So even if you were not a convicted felon, you hadn't been adjudicated mentally defective, there were no, domestic violence misdemeanors to your name, a police chief could still say, nah, I just don't really think you're the right type of person to own a gun.
Right. And I think that's indicative of an understanding of what local control means that I think doesn't bear out in what local law enforcement often looks like. We've seen so many cases, like with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, in which the local police there were like, this seems fine and cool. We're just going to move on. And so I think that to me seems to be a real challenge here, because you have an understanding, you see, and what we see over and over again is the what I would say the we got to do something style of politics, which is that an event takes place and you hear a rush to legislation from people who are, in my view, well-meaning. They understand that not only are they in opposition to, say, obviously mass shootings or a school shooting, or even domestic terrorism. So this, after the El Paso shooting a couple of years ago, there was a call from some Republicans and Democrats to criminalize domestic terrorism, which I found to be problematic, because what I find, domestic terrorism is itself not a technical federal crime, because everything that you would be doing as a means of domestic terrorism is covered by another crime. And what we've seen again and again is that what you think is domestic terrorism is then you look back later and you're like, hang on a sec, like, you get into kind of a COINTELPRO situation in which you have kind of like, what is agitation? What do all these terms mean? And so what I think you saw there is you saw a representative appealing to a constituency that is concerned about a specific issue in a specific context, and saying, like, wouldn't it be great if you could stop these people from having guns, from doing these things? And then you think back later, you're like, hang on. We're asking who to make this decision? On what basis? For what reason? And I think that that's one of the challenging things about our politics right now, is that our politics is it's so driven to performative action, because the actual action has so many ramifications later. It's the performative action that leads to laws that get people who are assisting an autistic child with a truck, get them shot by the cops, because you have, this idea of like, we need to call and do something about this. And so I think that it gets extraordinarily problematic when you have the same people who I think do believe that law enforcement has racist origins, but at the same time are thinking, but I also need to respond to this exact context in that exact moment. And so I think that gets really problematic. I know I've used that term numerous times, but I think it's challenging for legislatures, because they're attempting to respond to the chorus of we got to do something. And it's challenging on the ground because you have, since in many, it's the same way that, law enforcement differs across the country. Some law enforcement agencies, and even how law enforcement and criminal justice reform work within those law enforcement agencies differs. And so, this legislature might think it makes sense to ask people to do this, but at the same time, you're thinking on the ground, no, it doesn't make any sense. And it really strikes against, the constitutional protections we enjoy under the Second Amendment, but also just basic common sense.
Right. And that to me, I mean, I can argue the constitutional side of things all day long, but I realize that we live in a moment where, frankly, a lot of people don't care. If that's what the Constitution says, then the Constitution needs to be changed. So, I think if you're a Second Amendment supporter, you need to be able to argue beyond just the Constitution, because, frankly, there are just some people who are going to dismiss that argument. And that's where I think the common sense aspect of this, comes into play. And you look at something like, I think Emily Jaffe, I think is her name, at Slate. She did a fantastic piece last year where she went and she actually sat in the gun court in Brooklyn, New York for like 3 months. And she just wanted to see who's showing up, who's being arrested, who's being charged with. And basically the big charge is always possession of a firearm without a license, which was a misdemeanor offense in New York State, not in New York City, but a misdemeanor offense in New York State until the SAFE Act. Then it got up to a felony. And she pointed out that about 70% of the people that she saw going through that gun court facing these felony charges were young black guys without serious criminal histories, charged with a nonviolent offense for possessing a gun that quite frankly, if they had tried to go through the legal hoops and hurdles, they probably would have been denied a license because of New York's restrictive policies. They would have had to pay hundreds of dollars in non-refundable fees. They would have had to provide character witnesses and tax returns and all of this extra information. I mean, there are so many barriers to being a legal gun owner that, some people are saying, well, I'm not a violent criminal. I'm never going to use my firearm to commit a violent crime, but I want a gun to be able to protect myself because I live in a bad neighborhood. And it seemed like she said that, a lot of those individuals were the ones who were showing up, facing these felony offenses, facing 3.5 years in prison. And, again, I thought it was kind of interesting that she said she's still on board with, a lot of gun control laws, but watching how these laws actually get implemented in the real world definitely gave her pause. Right. And that's one of the things that I want to kind of explore here. And I hope that, look, we're as a political system, we're not really engaged in a lot of deep thought these days across the board. But this is, as you say, problematic.
And I think that gets at one of my many hobby horses, is that so much of what we're dealing with right now is the result of a simultaneous over-policing and under-policing. So we see that the application of the law is itself unequal, that some people can get away with breaking the law and some people are charged with offenses that aren't actually crimes. I remember a couple of years ago, I wrote about it. Someone was charged with a felony offense of jaywalking, which even in that area, it took place in Florida, jaywalking isn't a felony offense. And you don't need to always be carrying a license. And, this police officer asks this person who's an African-American man, like, oh, you always need to be carrying identification, which is not true. And so what we see there, and even in even in our understanding of what a bad neighborhood is, a bad neighborhood often is a place where you have simultaneous over-policing, where you can be pulled over for a broken taillight because those are finable offenses that can produce a monetary benefit to local governments. That's what we saw out of the Justice Department's report on Ferguson, Missouri, but also under-policing, in which break-ins aren't really pursued. And I think that something a lot of people don't know is that, and I think that this has led to the maximalist perspectives of the abolish the police crowd, is that a lot of violent crimes, for instance, sexual assault, go unsolved. And the police are largely, I think that in many cases, they are doing their absolute best. But in terms of broken windows type offenses, the police are very good at attempting to curtail those. But with sexual assault or violent crimes, a lot of times those go unsolved in a lot of areas. And the numbers would actually fill you with concern in certain areas. I think Honolulu has a open case rate that's just absurd, or edging, past 50%, but I'd want to double check that. And so what you see is that people, understandably, who live in these neighborhoods, where violent crime is under pursued, but, tagging a wall is over pursued, those are the people who are more likely to try and obtain a gun, which they cannot legally obtain. And then they are perceived over-policed for owning a gun to protect themselves from the under-policing they endure in their own neighborhoods. And so I think that the problem with all of these issues and so much of our politics is that it's really difficult to have these conversations in soundbite form, because it involves a lot of hemming and hawing and adding in context about especially the regional and localized nature of law enforcement, how law enforcement looks very different from city to city, from city to county. If you've ever lived in an area that is a major city surrounded by a county government, if you cross county lines, a lot of times those entities don't work with each other. Mm-hmm. I used to live in St. Louis, and St. Louis City Police and the county police, a lot of times their relationship was very different. I think that that's why a lot of, their relationships impact what crimes get pursued and what crimes don't. And if you can commit a crime in one area, how does that differ from if you commit a crime in a different area? And even what types of crimes get pursued. And so I think that simultaneous under and over policing is something that people are reacting to entirely understandably by saying that, I'm aware that, I've gotten pulled over dozens of times on my way to work, but when my neighbor got broken into and assaulted, the police officer showed up and implied it was kind of his or her fault. That's something that people are understanding. And so they're saying, I would rather live and be safe and take advantage of being able to obtain a firearm in these means. But also, as we've seen, ownership of a firearm itself, not just legally, but also culturally, who is permitted to own a firearm in our cultural imagination, and for whom is owning a firearm itself a sign that something has gone wrong. We hear a lot in Chicago about people owning like illegal firearms. And the implication clearly is that all of these people are owning illegal firearms to do illegal things.
Right.
How do we know that? We don't. We have no idea why individuals might own guns in Chicago, and why individuals, as you said, if you're living in an area of Chicago in which obtaining a gun is impossible except by illegal means, but you want to be able to keep yourself and your family safe, it's a discrepancy that's really challenging in terms of our politics and for our political conversations as well.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, and you know, you talk about politics being waged at sort of the soundbite level. And I think that's a huge part of it. I also think that, you know, the adversarial nature of politics these days is also kind of inhibiting these types of conversations where, you know, you and I will talk for 20 minutes or whatever, and we're not going to solve the issue. That's not why I invited you here, so that we could, you know, figure everything out in 20 minutes. But next time, we'll save that for the next time. But
perfect.
But even to have this conversation is now problematic in its own right. In Virginia this past session, you know, Democrats had like a half dozen gun control bills, and they were pretty much the traditional gun control bills. We're going to implement more restrictions on people's ability to legally own a firearm and what they can do with them. Republicans actually offered up a bill that was based on projects that have been done in Democrat-controlled cities like Oakland and Boston. It was based on Project Ceasefire, which started out in Boston back in the late 1990s. David Kennedy at John Jay College has written a fantastic book about this called Don't Shoot. And, you know, it's the idea of focusing on the most violent offenders in any given community, giving them the opportunity, the real opportunity to change their lives and to use those community resources to help them get their GEDs, to help them get jobs, to help them, you know, turn away from that gang lifestyle. But if they don't stop shooting, well, then there have to be consequences. And so, you know, you refer those cases to the U.S. Attorney's Office whenever possible. You ensure that, you know, the violent offenders, that again, there were going to be consequences, because we know that that's a real key in driving down violence. We also know that not everybody who's in a gang is going to turn out to be a prolific violent offender. And a lot of these individuals can be reached. They don't necessarily want to die at the age of 19 over some stupid beef on the street. So, you know, if you can give them the opportunity to change their life, you can do that. This was a Republican bill based on, you know, ideas that have been implemented by Democrats around the country. And not a single damn Democrat in Virginia co-sponsored that piece of legislation, which was incredibly frustrating to me as somebody who, you know, has looked at this issue and covered this issue for years and years. And I don't believe that I don't believe we can ban our way to safety. I don't believe we can arrest our way to safety. This to me seemed like a very smart approach, but it seemed like because it was coming from Republicans in Virginia, even though it had been, you know, dreamt up by people who weren't Republicans in Virginia, Democrats immediately shut it down and didn't want to have anything to do with it. And that to me is another problem here. We've got to be able to put, you know, at some point, we have to be able to put the politics aside and actually just start talking with one another as individuals about ideas, and without bringing all that political baggage to the table.
Yeah, and I also think that plays into attempting to satisfy or dissatisfy particular constituencies. The same cycle in Virginia, you saw Democrats raising the issue of passing laws against qualified immunity as part of a criminal justice reform package. And then they heard from police unions and police organizations saying, like, no, we can't do that. And these are Democrats in Virginia who just won a massive blue wave in the state that gives them control of the state government, and they can't do anything about qualified immunity. And so I think that really gets to one of the natures of our politics is we're not only trying to dissatisfy our opposition, we're trying to satisfy the people we believe might vote for us, even if that's not necessarily true. I think that, you know, how police unions feel about the Democratic Party right now has been pretty well detailed. But I do think that there is an understanding of our politics that in some ways it is meant to be in part performative, that we are not only doing the action of politics, we want to be seen doing the action of politics. And so I think that puts a lot of genuine reforms, and especially though, I always find it concerning whenever anyone uses terms like common sense reform or in any means, because I'm like, who's the common and whose sense are we talking about? So I think that one of the real challenges here is that for Democrats, especially on the local and state level, or Republicans on the local and state level, or even on the federal level. I remember when I talked to Senator Tim Scott about the issue of eliminating qualified immunity, and he was like, well, we basically have this police constituency, so that's a no-go. And so you have these particular issues in which they are, you have politicians who might be interested in these issues themselves. They might be interested in pursuing these agreements and these alliances themselves, but then their constituencies, especially, and I think that this is really important. We have so many people in this country who are engaged in what I call political hobbyism, in which any form of agreement with the other side is letting the team down. Everybody thinks about it like college football. You got your offensive line, your defensive line, and never the twain shall meet. And so you have a lot of Democrats for whom the second that you said that this plan originated from Republicans, or you have Republicans, if a Democrat sneezed near a particular piece of legislation, they just can't do it. Not because they disagree with it, but because you have a lot of people. You have your NRCCs and you have your down ballot Democratic organizations that are going to say, like, this person worked with Republicans on this piece of legislation or something like that. Even when you go back and you look at the legislation, you're like, it was fine. Right now we're in the midst of campaign season, and we're seeing a blitz of ads in which you have people who are being accused of of everything under the sun. And so many of these accusations come from, well, I worked with this person to support this particular piece of legislation, the context of which makes total sense and seems like a good idea. But because we are in the midst of a time of political hobbyism, which a lot of people were like, no, you just can't do that. You just can't do that. You're not allowed.
All right. Listen, last question, because we can talk for hours, but I know you've got other podcasts to do and you've got your own work to do. But do you think that this conflict between those competing groups, let's say in the Democratic coalition, and even those who are struggling to define what their priority is, reimagining policing or passing more gun control? I mean, I see this again kind of bubbling up to the surface here and there. But do you think this actually becomes an issue within the Democratic coalition, maybe after the election? As let's say, for me, it would be a worst case scenario. Let's say the Democrats take control of the Senate. You've got Joe Biden in the White House, and they start talking about these things. They start trying to prioritize these things. Does this become a real issue? And do we actually see a real discussion on the left of, okay, how do we reconcile reimagining policing with the old school gun control laws that we want to put in place?
I think that will become a very real concern, because I think that an important term you just used that I am going to get at a little bit is thinking about the left. Now, a lot of people who vote for Democrats would not consider themselves to be of the left. They think of themselves as like suburban blue dog Democrats, and suburban blue dog Democrats really like gun control legislation, because there is a sense, especially because I think that there is a sense that when you, especially after a tragic event or in the midst of a rise in gun violence, the idea becomes, this is the best means to curtail gun violence, that this doesn't happen in other countries, and that, we both know the context around a lot of these issues. And so I think what's going to be interesting is that Joe Biden is, if he were to win the presidency and Democrats gain the control of the Senate, he will have done so not through the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world, but through the Abigail Spanbergers of the world, who represent more centrist democratic norms that are more favorable to focusing on gun control as a priority. If you talk to left-leaning leftists, those are the people who don't like Joe Biden very much at all. And if you'll recall, a lot of what Bernie Sanders said, back in 2016 or earlier, Bernie Sanders was not a burn it all down gun control advocate. And a lot of leftists in Vermont very much were not. So I think you are going to see that conflict in terms of prioritization. I do think that, especially where it's going to be interesting, because I think that this might be one of those tit for tat instances, as we've seen President Trump signing executive orders on bump stocks, not getting a lot of response from a lot of the big gun rights organizations. So there have been a number of smaller ones that have obviously filed lawsuits about that because it was kind of made up and largely unconstitutional. But I think that you are going to see that conflict taking place, especially when it comes time to prioritize actions, and especially when it comes time to when these constituents say, hey, we pulled out the vote for you in suburban areas, in purple states. What are we going to get in result?
Interesting. All right, Jane Coaston, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me on the program today. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed the conversation with Jane Coaston. Hopefully we can have her back here again before long. Right now, let's turn our attention to today's Armed Citizen story, our recidivist report, our good deed of the day. We're going to start with our recidivist report, a story out of Berkeley, California. Interestingly enough, so yesterday on Bearing Arms, I had a column about a story that had appeared in the Atlantic. It was by a police abolitionist, actually, who lives in Berkeley. And was sexually assaulted in her home. She woke up one night and there was a stranger in her bedroom and she was kind of paralyzed and he reached for her and he kind of stroked his hand up her leg and she flipped out and screamed as anybody would do. And her kids actually came in the room and were able to, chase this guy off. He was eventually arrested. Now, the story was about basically her conundrum as a prison abolitionist, having to decide, do I want to press charges against this guy? Do I want to send him to prison? Do I want the prosecutors to offer him a plea bargain? Or do I want him to go to jail for a long, long time? It's a fascinating story, but it is also a reminder that even in places that have very restrictive gun control laws, you still have to worry about violent crime because criminals don't care what those laws are. Case in point, Murder charges filed after fatal Berkeley Hills shooting. The murder suspect had just been released from jail 3 days before the fatal shooting, according to court records. Yeah. This is from berkeleyside.com. And the man who's been arrested in the murder of 39-year-old Alfred Charles Taylor Jr. is a guy named Jesse McAllister. He's 26 years old, which is really not that old. Again, he's, 8 years removed from being a juvenile. He's now been charged with murder, as well as possession of a firearm by a felon, along with various special allegations that could lengthen his sentence if he's convicted, according to court documents. Berkeley Side reports that McAllister had just been released from the Santa Rita jail 3 days before the fatal shooting and is on probation for being a felon in possession of a firearm. He had been arrested in June in connection with a gunfire investigation in the Southside neighborhood. He's also been convicted in the past of felony assault likely to produce great bodily injury, as well as burglary. And now, again, there are some questions that have to be answered here. Why was McAllister released from jail in the first place? And why was he on probation for being a felon in possession of a firearm, given his violent felony convictions? Now, look, theoretically, I'm actually okay with the idea of once you've done your time, you've served your sentence, you get out, you should have all your rights restored. In theory. But that's not the way the law works now. And coupled with that theory of once you've done your time, you should have your rights restored, I also believe that there should be real time for real serious violent crimes. And it sounds like Mr. McAllister, who again is just 26 years of age, has never really done any serious time for any of his serious crimes. Now, unfortunately, he's facing the most serious charges of his life. A life has allegedly been lost, or a life has been lost allegedly at McAllister's hands. And again, I think the public has a right to know why Jesse McAllister was out on the street to begin with. Now, our armed citizen story of the day from Port Huron, Michigan. Now, this one's still under investigation. It happened a couple of days ago. I haven't seen any updates here. But WWJ News Radio 950 reports that a sheriff's office dispatched to a property on complaints of a breaking and entering. And when they got there, they found a suspect who had been shot in the face. According to the sheriff's office, a 50-year-old homeowner was armed when he confronted the alleged intruder there at that property. The suspect then ran out. The homeowner did not try to, shoot him in the back or anything like that. It's actually alleged that he got in his car, the suspect did, and then drove at the property owner. And that is when the property owner fired multiple times, hitting the suspect in the face. The wounded man, identified as a 27-year-old from Kimball Township, went to a local hospital, last listed in serious condition. The Port Huron Major Crimes Unit continues to investigate, but if the homeowner's story checks out, I cannot imagine that he'd be facing any charges because that would be a clear-cut case of self-defense. He was in fear for his life as the guy was driving at him. We'll keep our eyes on this story. We'll give you any more details as they become available. And finally today, our good deed of the day. I got to say, I saw this story yesterday afternoon, and I immediately thought, okay, I cannot wait to talk about this. Take a look at this barbecue rig. This is awesome. This is, this is called this is the Big Frank, I believe is what it's called. And it actually comes from a barbecue place called the Smoking Gun Barbecue Pit. Yes, I love it. On Thursday afternoon, the owners of Big Frank's Barbecue ended up making a donation here. They donated the Texan Smoking Gun Barbecue Pit to Sheriff Bobby Rader, in Liberty County, Texas. I think the sheriff of a place called Liberty County deserves a big honking gun as a barbecue bit, don't you think? According to Bluebonnet News, they say that Sheriff Rader was nearly at a loss for words, hard-pressed to express his tremendous gratitude to the merchants for the most precious gift that will be pressed into service when the Liberty County Sheriff's Office personnel are on round-the-clock duty during hurricanes, extended flooding conditions, or having to remain on duty at the Sheriff's Office eating cold sandwiches and candy bars while sleeping in chairs or, on the floor there. Said having a hot meal straight off the barbecue pit will be a very welcome change of pace to what the deputies and civilian personnel have had to use in past emergencies. The owner of Big Frank's, Melissa Leal, says that, quote, "We're excited about giving the Smoking Gun Barbecue Pit to the hardworking men and women of the Liberty County Sheriff's Office. In addition, by the way, the Slovacek Sausage Company is donating sausage for the pit for the next year." Yeah. Now, if there's a local brisket company around, they should get on board with that too. Sheriff Rader said he appreciates the community support from the local merchants and the concern that they've shown for the sheriff's personnel. He says that when an emergency strikes, all law enforcement agencies, fire departments, and all first responders are more than welcome to drop by the sheriff's office and partake of a hot meal from the Smoking Gun Barbecue Pit. There you go. In the right place, at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. The folks from a Big Frank's Barbecue there in Liberty County, Texas, we appreciate you and thank you for your very good deed. That is all the time that we've got for you on this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. I want to thank you for being a part of the program as well. Hopefully you have a great weekend. You get a chance to get out and exercise your Second Amendment rights a little bit, do some shooting. I have quite a bit of goat and pig dew to clean up. But that's Saturday morning. Saturday afternoon, my shooting spot. Got a freshly bush hogged last week, so it's good to go. I'm going to break into my stash a little bit. I think I'm going to stick with the 22. That's what I got the most of. But yes, I will be exercising my Second Amendment rights this weekend. Hope that you do too. In the meantime, be well, be safe, be free, and we'll see you soon with another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam & Company.